Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 and the final video on how to install Klipper the easy way using the Klipper installation update helper. So, in the last video, we just finished off flashing our mainboard with the klipper.bin file, and we have gotten a USB ID, which means we have successfully flashed the board. We're ready to build our printer config file for Klipper. So, we're going to go to our mainsail web interface here. You'll see we have an error. Klipper state startup printer is not ready because Klipper doesn't know yet how to connect to the actual printer itself. We have the ID, but we haven't told Klipper what that ID is to connect to the mainboard. So we need to build a printer.cfg. If we go into our printer.cfg file here, I'll show you what it looks like. Because this is running on a Raspberry Pi 3, sometimes a web interface can take a little while to buffer here. So you can see our config's empty. We don't have anything in here. I'll walk you through a couple little things here right off the get-go so you can kind of see what's going on. So this is an empty shell. There's no configuration in here. What's happening is we are including another config file which contains our macros, and we'll go over those in a little bit. Here is where we would tell Klipper where our USB port essentially is. So how, from the Raspberry Pi, how would it talk to our mainboard? This is where we're going to put an RD. We have 3 items here that are required by mainsail. We need print resume, display status, virtual SD card. Where are the G-code files stored? So these are already in here by default. And then we have one little section here which talks about the printer kinematics, but we're not going to worry so much about that right now. So, what's the first thing we should do? That would be, we need to copy a template, if you will, configuration to this so that we can start building our config file. We don't need to build this from scratch. There's already config files up on the GitHub. So, let's go back to the Klipper GitHub. And as you can see here, we're back in the configuration folder. So if, for instance, we were setting up Klipper on an Ender 3, for instance, we could go to the Kiauh Ender 3, and we could simply copy everything that's here into our config file and put in the ID, and Klipper would connect to the Ender 3, and we would be able to print. So let's go back here to the config folder and let's look for our mainboard. So we've been using the FISEC spider, which we have here. And what we're going to do is we're going to just copy, we'll copy everything in this config file here. So let's just grab all of the text here all the way down to the bottom. We'll copy this, go back to our printer config, and we're going to replace the printer section here, but that's it. So we're going to right click, we're going to go paste, and we're going to paste all the information in here. Now, something to note, at the very top of this file, we have a section where we're pointing to our USB ID like we talked about. There's also the section here, so it's doubled up. Just make sure you are aware of this. It doesn't matter where it is in the config file. We're going to leave it down at the bottom, and I'm just going to remove that part. So pretty straightforward. We only want one section pointing us to our USB. And based on just that looking at this is just a generic, it's just a template, USB Klipper firmware, a bunch of numbers. It doesn't actually, this won't work. If we go save and restart, this is still not going to connect to our mainboard because again, Klipper doesn't know what USB port to look for the mainboard. So let's open PuTTY again. And like the previous video, let's connect to my printer and let's find out that ID again. And this is why the Kiauh script or the Kiauh Klipper update helper is so handy. You don't have to remember all these commands and stuff like that to find IDs and stuff out. All we have to do is PuTTY into our My Printer, log in with the Pi and the password, press the up arrow, launch the Kiauh script, go 4, which is advanced, and let's get the ID again. Let's press 6, get MCU ID over USB. And here's our ID. Let's copy this. We can right click in here and it will copy it. We'll go back into our config file. Let's go down to the bottom. Let's paste that in here. And let's save and restart this and see what happens. So I can see there we connected right away for a second. But we're getting an error now saying MCU shut down, ADC out of range, temperatures exceeded. So I know right away, because I see this error, one of my thermistors isn't correct. You can see here my temperature exceeds the configured minimum temp and max temp. And this is because I'm using a mainboard that's not actually plugged into a printer. If you already had your printer wired, you shouldn't get this error message, but Klipper will generally tell you what's going on. So I know I have an out of range on one of my temperature thermistors. So let's go into my printer. Let's go down to my temperature area in my config file for my actual two basic thermistors. One is the extruder. I can see here I have my extruder set up. These are the pinouts that I copied right from the FISEC spider, so that all these pin numbers are correct. I verified I have an extruder thermistor plugged into my main board. So let's go check again. Where's the next place here? I have a heat bed section here, but I don't have a thermistor plugged in to this. This is why Klipper is complaining at me right now. So we're going to comment this section out only for the purpose of this video. Again, my main board is not connected to a printer. It's just literally sitting beside me on my desk. So I'm simply just putting in the pound or number sign here to comment these sections out. I'm going to save and restart, and let's see what happens. You can see Klipper was thinking there. We'll give it a couple more seconds, and we have successfully connected. You can see Klipper knows now what the MCU version is, and it can tell what the frequency of the processor of the MCU or mainboard is. And if we click on the dashboard, we now have a graph here of my temperature of my extruder. We have successfully connected our Klipper on the Raspberry Pi to the actual mainboard. So let's do a really quick walk around of mainsail and Klipper and how you can configure this for your specific printer. So right now we're on the dashboard. This is where you're going to spend most of your time. This is where you home your printer here. There's a couple different options. This is the standard homing selection that you have. The beauty of mainsail and fluid is you can fully customize this to whatever you like. If you look up in the top right hand corner here with the cog, we have a whole bunch of stuff we can change here. We can set a printer name. Let's call this, let's just say Ender 3. We can change our language. We can back up things. We can factory reset this. We can change our console. So the little console here on the right, we can change how it works, the height of it, hide temperature readouts constantly. We can go to control section here. We can change our style for controls. I prefer the cross style. You can see here the controls have changed to the typical cross, up, down, left, right kind of thing is a little bit easier for me. We can change some default speeds. So if when I move the cross or when I click on one of the buttons, maybe I want like a 15 option in here. We can add 15 here if we want to. We can customize our dashboard for a widescreen display, our desktop, a tablet. How do we want to look at on mobile? If on my phone, all I want to see is my webcam and maybe my controls, I can turn all the rest off and it will customize that for my mobile screen. For my computer screen, maybe I don't want my print settings, temperature, machine settings, and I don't want a console. You can see here how it disabled all that. This is very, very customizable. And that's one of the beauties of mainsail, is it's so easy to make this your own. We can come down in here to some other items, G-code editor, or you can view your G-code in mainsail, which is really neat. You can set up custom macros. So if you want your printer to home a certain way, you have auto bed leveling you want to do, you can set up custom macros here. We can set up presets. Let's say I want to preheat my printer for PLA. I can set my extruder temperature to 220. I can put custom G-code in here as well. If I had a heated bed, there'd be a heated bed option here. I can store my preset. I can add additional Klipper printers from here. Again, if you had this running on a laptop or desktop, you can add multiple printers in here. I can change my UI settings. My printer might have a, orange and black theme, for instance. So I can set up how my logo color looks, and I can set up how my text looks. Maybe I want silver text. You can see here my logo at the top by the Ender 3 is now orange. And I can set up all my webcam settings if I had a webcam. So that's kind of the general quick overview of how to set up the interface. Very, very customizable. It's much better than Marlin or even, in my opinion, RepRap firmware. We can see our console here is just a bigger version of the mini console that we have on the dashboard. We can see our G-code files. This is where we would upload G-code directly to our printer. We have a G-code viewer. In here we can actually view the sliced G-code, which is really neat. We have our history. How long has this printer been printing? What jobs have finished? What jobs has failed? And then we have our machine settings. We can go in here, and this is where we were editing our printer config. So that's a really quick overview of the interface. Let's go back into the printer config here, and let's go through a few things, and I will try my best to explain a lot of this. A lot of this is learned just by doing, and in my opinion, Klipper does a really good job of kind of explaining what each of these do. If you want to go to the Klipper website, there is a really nice guide that tells you every single line, what position max is, what position end stop, what microsteps are, all that kind of stuff. It will explain those in detail. However, it is pretty straightforward at first glance to kind of see what's going on here. So, for instance, here is my X stepper. So this is telling Klipper which pins are used to communicate with my stepper driver on X. This is also telling me my end stop. So when I have my X end stop plugged in, this is the pin that's plugged in on the board. I can also change the direction of my printer. So if my X was homing to the right and I want it home to the left, I can put an exclamation mark in here, and that will reverse my direction. We can set the max position. So how big of X do I have? How big of Y do I have down here in my Y? Same thing goes for the Y end stop. There's another pin out here for Y. We have our Z steppers here. Again, the pinouts for Z. If we had an Z end stop, and how much Z travel we have. We have our extruder here. Again, the pins for the stepper for the extruder. This is where we set up our extruder thermistor. Klipper already has a good list of predefined thermistors. So beta 3950s, the 100K versions are all in there, and you can find that in the Klipper documentation. And this is our PID tune. This is the default PID tune. You would normally rerun a PID tune just from a command line, and then it would automatically put the values in here for you. Here is the extra stepper ports. Because we are using a FISEC spider, we have a bunch more stepper ports. So we can set up multiple extruders. These can also be Z motors. We can rename these to be Z motors. They don't have to be extruders. Here's our heated bed that we commented out. Again, what pin heats the bed up, where our thermistor pin is, and here's our thermistor right here. How we're controlling the bed temperature, whether it's PID or watermark. You would generally want to change this to PID and do a PID tune on your bed as well. Our fan ports. We have 3 fan ports here. We can set up a whole bunch of different options. However, the default generally does a pretty good job. So We can set up, how the fan speed and max power and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of cool configuration we can do there. We have LED control through Klipper, so we can set LED values for RGB LEDs that are plugged into our main board. Here's our ID, so Klipper knows where to find the main board. And down here, this is the kinematics for our printer. So if this was an Ender 3, Cartesian is correct. This is the maximum velocity that the printer can travel at. So 300 millimeters a second is as fast as the printer can go. This is our maximum acceleration, so how long it takes the printer to get up to max speed. Generally, you would start this off at like 1,000 and 100, depending on what type of printer you're building. Here is our UART configuration for Klipper. So this is how Klipper controls each individual stepper. If we had 2208 drivers or 2209 drivers, here's where we can control the amps for our stepper motors. When you build DIY printers, you can control all of these things. 2209 and TMC 2208s have software controllable amps. You don't have to set them via a little screw. You can set that right in the config file, which is very, very nice. We can turn on stealth chop, or we can turn it off. If you want the printer to be quieter or you want to print really fast, we could turn on spread cycle mode here. So this is the section here where you're telling Klipper how to communicate with the stepper driver. In the configuration up here, we're just telling Klipper that, hey, I have a stepper driver for X. Here's where the stepper driver is located, but we're not telling it, any parameters based on the 2209s, and that's where we're doing that down here. Now, I generally prefer to copy these out and put them right below their corresponding stepper. So for instance, I want to have my stepper information here and also my UART information here for X. I like to keep these logical. It's based on personal preference. These can be anywhere in the config file. Here we have more, again, SPI UART communication with different types of steppers. So these 2130s communicate over SPI, I guess, not UART. I've never dealt with these, but again, if I'm not using these can be taken out, right? These are all commented out, so we don't need this. We're not using those. And then our EXP1 and EXP2 pins, those are for displays, and you don't need to touch these. Okay, and that's kind of a very, very brief run through of the config file, but this is why Klipper is so flexible. You can add or take away stuff from this config file. Just go save and restart, and your change automatically takes effect. You do not have to recompile firmware like Marlin. This is probably the simplest and most streamlined firmware for 3D printers, and it makes building custom 3D printers so easy. Let's also talk about the Kiauh or Kiauh macros.config file here. So in this config file, it has standard macros for canceling a print, pausing a print, and resuming a print. These are templates right from mainsail, so that when I'm printing something and I hit cancel, this is what runs when I hit the cancel button in mainsail. And you can customize these. I'm not going to go into macros too much. They're a little bit out of the scope of this video. Same thing with resume here. Again, you can do some research and learn on how to do macros. But essentially what a macro is it just runs some G code, or you can run custom commands here. So we have all of our macros in this macro config file. However, you could put all the macros in this config file and just have one big config file if you want. But in this configuration, and how Kiauh does this by default, is it makes a separate config file for you that contains all of your macros. So you can just go to your macro config and it's a bit cleaner. So again, it's personal preference. So that is the final episode in how to install Klipper the easy way. I will put my Discord server down below. Feel free to join my Discord if I have a channel on there for Clipper help. And feel free to play around with this. Like I say, Clipper is not as hard as it seems, especially if you use the install helper like we've done in this series. It's very straightforward. It handles all the obscure commands. You don't have to jump around with 3 to 4 or 5 different pages figuring out what you need to do. And I think it really makes it much more easier for people to get into. And like I say, Clipper supports a lot of stock printers like Enders, Tronxy printers, ANET printers. You know, go out, play around with this, buy a cheap printer, and throw Clipper on it. It's the best way to learn. And again, my Discord is below. Feel free to join. I have a really great community starting to be built up on there. And again, I appreciate all the new subscribers. Thanks, everyone.